Okay, so welcome to Perfecting Line Breaks in Poetry. I record our sessions so that you can go back if you need to, if you want to rewatch them, or if somehow you have to miss a class, I'll always send you guys the link to the recording, so you'll have that option. And it'll be unlisted on my YouTube, so you'll be able to go back to it in perpetuity. So welcome, welcome. I'm Lynne Golodner. Some of you know me, some of you don't. And it's great to see some familiar faces and some new faces. And I'll tell you just a little bit about me, and then get to hear about each of you, and then we'll get started. So I have been a writer all my life. My first book published was a book of poetry in 1996. I have two books of poetry out, six nonfiction books, and my first novel is coming out this fall. And I was a journalist for 15 years, and I am a marketing entrepreneur. I've been working in marketing for an equal number of years, and I've taught writing since the 90s. I teach a lot of online writing classes and in-person writing retreats. I work one-on-one with writers, and really merged my life over the past few years from doing marketing all the time to getting back to my writing, working with authors, helping them learn marketing and get published. And so I sort of combine the best of both worlds now. So I'm really excited to teach this class because I think poetry gets the short end of the stick when it comes to writing classes these days. And I don't know anywhere that focuses on the line break. And it's just sort of a pet peeve of mine that there is an art to it. There is reasons to break the lines in different ways. And so, and I've worked with a lot of poets in various classes of mine through writing workshops. I teach a Finding Your Voice class where a lot of people find me, and it's open to any genre. And I just think that, becoming a poet is largely about owning the genre and feeling empowered and comfortable to know all the different aspects of what makes a poem different from prose. So that's why I created this class, and I'm very excited to welcome you all to it. Um, Also, I'm based in Detroit. I have four kids between the ages of 16 and almost 21. And I'm a busy writer. So let's go around. I'd like to meet each of you. Tell me where you are, what you're hoping for from this class, and anything that you might find interesting. And I'm just going to call on you the way I see you on my screen, and then we'll jump into the class after that. So, Lee Wen, would you go first?
Hi, everybody. Li Wen. I live in New York City, and I have two boys, 14 and 17. So I was a journalist in China many years ago. I wrote for English language daily newspaper at that time. So and then came here, full-time mom, and now a few years ago started writing. I am a big fan of Lynne. I've been taking her class in maybe 5, 6, at least everywhere. Whatever she's offering, I want to be part of her life. She's a phenomenal writer and a teacher and a mentor, I would say. So for poetry, I didn't really love poetry before, but past 2 years, I'm going through lots of personal life change. So I start reading poetry, it just get me. I'm trying to understand, people, how do they, express the inner feelings. So for me, for taking the class, I just want to learn more about poetry. So I get to meet everybody. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for your lovely words. So glad you're here. Sam, will you go next?
Sure, Sam Fogelman. Let's see. I have 3 children, all well out of the house, with 2 grandchildren. I am retired. I was an accountant, which I know is probably an odd place to start trying to write poetry from, for most people would think of. And any rate, aspiring poet. Have been Mary Oliver and Billy Collins are 2 of my favorites. Billy for his sense of humor, and Mary just for the beauty of her writing and how she engages with nature. So looking forward to learning more about this. I've just started writing in the last year and a half, so I'm still learning things, terminology like what the heck enjambment means. So.
And where are you based?
Oh, I'm Birmingham, so north of Detroit.
Oh, you're near me. Okay, very cool. Awesome. Love it. Great to welcome. Dina, will you go next?
Hi, everyone. Excuse my printer. Sometimes when I turn my computer on, it prints whatever was sent to it. I am from Maine. I have 3 kids, one off to college and 2 still at home with me. My husband is a lobster fisherman. By day, I work at an elementary school as administrative assistant. A few years ago, I got my liberal arts degree with a concentration in English, and I loved it. And then I did a lot of writing and then kind of fell off it because life happened, and that's what happens. And then about a year ago now, I guess, I saw Lynn's Finding Your Voice class on writing workshops, and I was like, oh, that is so me. And since then we've had a journey together. I'm like Lynne, I take everything that Lynn offers, oh my word, offers that I can get, because she just helps me so much and digs that stuff out of me. I've been writing poetry since I was a child, since I could even think about writing, and I've submitted and so now I'm just kind of wondering what I'm missing, and I'm hoping that line breaks will help me quite a bit. So that's me.
First of all, I did not know that your husband was a lobsterman, and so now we have so much more to talk about because I'm fascinated and I've read some interesting stories. So we're going to have that conversation. And just a quick little comment, but the poems, it may not be you. That may not be the reason that they're not getting published, but we can talk about that too. So for sure, yeah. But
My husband's a lobsterman. My dad was a lobsterman. My grandfather was a lobsterman. That's basically the way of life where I live. Yeah.
I love it. I
We
love
live
it.
on an island off the coast of Maine. That's
So cool. We have lots to talk about, Dina. So yeah, cool. Awesome. Welcome. Lori, will you go next, please?
Hi. Hi, everybody. I live in New Mexico, southern New Mexico, 40 miles from Mexico proper. I retired here a year ago. I had a marketing business specializing in search engine optimization.
Okay.
But I sold that business, then I retired, and I have had a poem published, and I want to have more, but it doesn't really matter. I just super enjoy learning all the intricacies and the profundities. Let's see, I lived in New York for 35 years, and then I moved to Colorado, where I lived for 16 years and just retired in New Mexico.
Nice, nice. Welcome. That's great. Deanne, will you go next?
Hello.
Hey.
I am very happy to be here. Now I know that you're the best teacher around, Lynn. So this is my first time.
I hope I measure up. I hope I measure up to their lovely words.
This is my first time in one of your classes, and I've been taking other classes with the writing workshops. And I'm from a little town called Louisville, Colorado, which is outside of Boulder.
Nice.
And I am a native Coloradan. And I am sort of semi-retired. So I am actually at my work now, but I don't have any students. I teach in a school that's 1 student to 1 teacher.
Ooh.
So it's one-on-one. And today, Fridays, I don't have any students. So they let me jump on the computer and do my class.
Nice.
And I have been following a bunch of poets on Substack.
Okay.
And I particularly like Alexi Sherman.
Yeah.
And I have been trying to study how and when to do line breaks when you're not doing a particular metered thing. And he does it beautifully, but I can't figure it out by just reading. So I was very excited to see your class. So I saw it and signed up immediately because it was like, that is exactly what I need to know. So.
Great. So glad you're here. That's wonderful. Claire, will you go next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Claire Newman. I live in Dallas, Texas. But Lynn knows we spent some time in Michigan as well, which is great. I took Lynn's class last semester, I guess, or whatever, in the fall. And one of the things that came out of that, in one piece I wrote a poem, and I said, I don't think I've written a poem since the 3rd grade or something like that. And Lynn, in her very supportive way, said, well, how fortunate, because you need some work on line breaks, but I'm taking a class, or I'm teaching a class. And so that's one of the reasons I'm here, but big fan of Mary Oliver as well, and many others, and delighted to be here, Lynn. I echo others, and I really enjoyed your last class. So looking forward to this one.
So glad to see you again, Claire. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks.
April, will you go next?
Hi, I'm April Krasner. I am actually an academic. Excuse me. I live in Connecticut, but I teach at NYU. I've been teaching creative and expository writing for many years. Creative writing, not so much, since they reorganized. But I write time. I've had some published in different places. Lots are fascinating to me. All my poems look like blocks. Every single one. I don't know how to utilize space on the page, and when I do, it just looks like arbitrary and ridiculous. So I go back to my block, and it feels safe and kind. I also, I love this broad range of people from all over. The students I work with are quote unquote post-traditional students, meaning they're supposed to be a little older, going back for their education. I have a noisy dog that I will try and keep myself muted when possible.
Okay.
And that's probably plenty from me. Oh, there is actually, I was thinking about Sam when you were introducing yourself, because William Carlos Williams was a doctor, and then there's another one. Who sold insurance? There's a really well-known poet who sold insurance. So being in the financial area is nothing, in terms of or everything, depending upon your approach. So I'm really happy to be here, everyone.
So glad you're here too, April. It's actually a really good point. I think, I did my MFA from Goddard College in Vermont, and it's a low residency MFA, which is very popular now. There were like 2 or 3 schools at the time when I did it, but low residency means you don't live there the whole time. So you go up for 10 days at a time, and then you do your work, and you're in correspondence with your professors and your group, and then you come back. And so it was actually brilliant, because when you're writing about your life, about your experiences, your surroundings. If you're all in the same place, are you all writing about the same things? It's interesting to think about. So I think that having other pursuits and expertise is super important for all writers of all genres, because you're interpreting your world through the written word, and who better to do that than people who have all different professions and interests and training. So very, very cool. Thank you for saying that. Steve, will you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Steve Willett. I'm in Jersey City. I have a wife and 2 kids, and I'm a project manager at a company that does DEI for women in the workplace. So that's enjoyable. I'm kind of new to poetry. I kind of came in like 2019. It's amazing what an awkward lunch with your mom can do, which I basically went home, wrote a poem about that, and submitted it to a international poetry contest, and it was published.
Amazing.
So,
Great.
I was like, maybe there's something there. And I just, I actually am a part of the Jersey City Writers. I do moderating. We meet every Wednesday night online, and I'm kind of helping them with their develop a poetry festival sometime in April. And so I'm intrigued with soundscapes. So I have a ton of line breaks in my poems. I usually have anywhere between 2 to 5 people that I pick from the audience to help me with the poem, and speaking either over each other, under each other, as we're doing the poem together, to kind of have an experience type of thing. So, but I'm just really intrigued. I really don't know much about like the fundamentals, and that's what I'd like to really kind of strengthen, and that's why I was and my wife got me this for Christmas, so I was just really excited to be a part of this.
Awesome, great, wonderful. All right, so I want to start with a couple of things, and those of you who know me will know this. I prepare way more material than we can probably fit into our time. So just to let you know that there will be instructional material and things like that that I likely won't finish during class. And so I will end up putting it in the Google Drive. So the Google Drive has been shared with all of you, and I'm going to put the link again in the chat for those of you who came a little bit later than others. And so you should have had an invitation. If you didn't find that, now you can go to it from this link in the chat. And I'm just going to share my screen and show you what's in there right now. So right now, there are a few documents. There's the syllabus, which is right here. There's some examples that we're going to talk about in class that I created a PDF for. There's an article called The Melody of Form. The first week's notes are in here, first week's lesson. If you want to pull it up to follow when we're going along, you don't have to. And then there are writing exercises that are in there as well. And I will be putting up additional PDFs of subsequent lessons as we go. So the way that a 4-week Zoom class typically goes is we just meet on Zoom 4 times. But I do know that writers like to submit their writing for review. And so I have decided to add to this class the option for you to submit 2 poems for feedback during the course of the class. And so what I would ask you to do is to upload it to the Drive or email it to me. And just if you upload it to the Drive, let me know that it's there because I may not check. So, and I will be happy to give you some feedback on it. So 2 poems per person I will take a look at during the course of the class. You don't have to, but that is an option. So I don't normally do that in Zoom classes, but we have a small group, so I think I could be able to do that. I also want to start by saying that you already know I have 2 books of poetry published. I have an MFA in poetry, okay? When I was in college at the University of Michigan, I thought I was the dumbest person when it came to poetry. I remember taking their intro to poetry class, and I had this professor, and there was some poem we had to read. I don't even remember which one it was now, probably because of how she responded. And she said, what is this poem about? And I was looking at it and I'm like, well, I think maybe this, maybe that. And then she's like, wrong, it's not about that. And just shut me down. And I really, really thought, okay, well, I don't see her meaning. And so I must be too dense. Like I can't understand what this poem is doing. And I carried that with me until I moved to New York City in 1993. And I was part of this amazing writer's workshop in the Village at a woman's apartment. She was originally from Detroit. And I went every Tuesday faithfully. I think I was the youngest person there. And there were New York Times writers. There was like an 80-year-old woman with a ton of books. There was Grace Paley would come. Like, that's amazing. Like, there were famous people who came to this. And I was like this little 22-year-old scribbling furiously, submitting very bad poems for review. And it was an amazing, amazing experience. And what I learned from that was that how you read a poem is how you read a poem. And there's a lot more access that we have than we think. And anybody who's telling you that you're wrong in how you interpret a poem has something to learn. And then later, I moved to Washington, D.C. I was very active at the Bethesda Writers Center in Maryland. And I remember a friend of mine, another writer, and I went to this poetry reading from this poet. There was a poem of his that was all of 2 lines that we read, and we were debating, what does it mean? 2 lines, you guys, 2 lines. And I was like, I think it means this. And she's like, I think it means that. And we really couldn't come to any agreement. So after he read, we approached him and said, you've got to settle this argument. What does this poem really talk about? And he's like, it really doesn't matter what I intended when I wrote it, because once it leaves me, it's what it means for you. And so, of course, we wanted to hear what he intended, but he wouldn't tell us. And so it was just, these are profound lessons that I think are super important as you enter the world of poetry, to understand that meaning in the written word and a written piece really varies from reader to reader. And it's a conversation between the poet and the reader. That said, it's funny. I want to say there are no rules. There are tons of rules. But you have to know the rules in order to know how to break them. And that's what can be hard about, writing structure, strategy, theme, all of that stuff. Like, you really should become familiar with the typical modes of writing poetry so that you understand when you deliberately do something else. And so we're going to talk about different ways to look at line breaks over the next 4 weeks, because what makes a poem different from prose is how it appears on the page. Plain and simple. The use of white space, the lack of white space, the way we break up lines, the way it looks is a part of a poem's existence. And so there has to be rhyme and reason for why you break the lines where you do, why you choose the words you do. Poetry by nature should be much tighter and more condensed than any other mode of writing. But if you take any of my other classes or you work with me one-on-one, you'll hear me make recommendations for tightening up your prose, because anytime you can get rid of extraneous words, your writing will be better. So, but a poem is much tighter than prose usually. It's not just full sentences chopped up into lines. There are reasons for things, and I want to encourage you to develop your reasons for why you do it the way you do it. So, Lori, were you the one who said you had block poems? Or was that April? April, okay. So there's nothing wrong with having block poems if that's your style, if there's a reason for it. There's something called prose poetry. And frankly, I'm going to make an admission. When I write my poems, I just write across the page, and it's one big, huge line, like block of writing. And I go back and I lineate as another exercise. It's just part of my process. First, I want to get the concept down and the words, and then I want to look at it and craft it and sculpt it into a poem. That's just my process. That's just how I do it. So at some stage, if you looked at some raw versions of my poems, it would look like a big mass of words. It wouldn't look like poetry, because that's the process. So just understand that we're talking about one aspect of poetry. I will be happy to answer questions about any aspect of any kind of writing really in this class. But just know that this is one aspect that makes it poetry, So what I'd like to do before I jump into lecturing and all that stuff is I'd like to look at a poem, and let's read it, and then let's discuss the line breaks. Like, what do we think of it? This is a Mary Oliver poem, and I'm a big proponent of when we read poetry, we read it twice so that we can really digest it. So do I have any volunteers who might want to read it for the first time?
Happy to.
Thank you.
Death at Wind River. In their dreams, the bullets shine red as roses in their grandmother's cheeks. The horses gallop again over the children. The young men can't kill fast enough. In their dreams, they sleep with the moon, but mostly they drag their heels in the dust. They pour whiskey down their throats. They sharpen their knives on nothing but stones. They have raged drunk over their old grandmothers. They have stumbled on the ghosts of the children. After that, all their nerves click like frozen leaves. They will walk out under the branches of hopelessness. They think of this world welcoming the bodies of their sons.
Thank you. Who would like to read it a second time?
I will.
Thank you.
Death at Wind River. In their dreams, the bullets shine red as roses. In their grandmother's cheeks, the horses gallop again over the children. The young men can't kill fast enough. In their dreams, they sleep with the moon, but mostly they drag their heels in the dust. They pour whiskey down their throats. They sharpen their knives on nothing but stones. They have raged drunk over their old grandmothers. They have stumbled on the ghost of the children. After that, all their nerves click like frozen leaves. They walk out under the branches of hopelessness. They think of this world welcoming the bodies of their sons.
Thank you. So any thoughts about line breaks in this poem? Or about
that one that says on nothing but stones.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting one, because one of my questions when I first read this was, why do we need on nothing? Why can't it just be they sharpen their knives on stones? So it's important to the poet. This is Mary Oliver. She didn't do anything without reason, but they sharpen their knives on nothing but stones. And so that's an important emphasis that she deliberately put in this poem, because if I were editing, I'd say, well, they could just, so the nothing, she wants us to hang on that. That's the emphasis as opposed to where they actually sharpen it. So why do you think?
I think that one of the things is she wants the double meaning of sharpening their knives on nothing and sharpening their knives on nothing but stones, which is also, they think of this world welcoming and welcoming the bodies. So there's that double, one of the things I love about it's not double entendre, but it's doubleness of a line that I love, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And, you know, the punctuation is important to understand with line breaks, which we'll talk about over the course of the next 4 weeks. But, you know, when a line ends and there isn't a comma, there isn't a period, there isn't a dash or something, there's supposed to be a pause at the end of a line break. The line is supposed to be its own entity, that those words grouped together should be some idea or something we want to fixate on for a second. And a lot of times you break a line because you have 4 or 5 words that are just really cool together and you want them to sit alone. And so it can be that simple. But, you know, there's a slight pause when there's no punctuation at the end of a line. It's a pause that leads into the next line. The meaning is still flowing, whereas a comma is a little bit lengthier of a pause and a period is a definite pause. So, at both or on nothing and at welcoming, there's no punctuation. So it's a very slight pause to blend into the next line as well.
And it's not a break, I don't think, but I love how she starts within their dreams and then carries it into the second stanza as the starting point, as I guess getting back to that doubling and reinforcing the sense of where they are.
You know, sorry, the other thing, and I heard this on the second reading, but I did not, which is, you know, why it's so great to hear something a second time, because you hear different carryovers or different meanings, is the bullets shine red as roses. It's the same thing, and red as roses in their grandmother's cheeks. That same thing that I heard very differently on the second read. And that sort of a way, you know, that's another thing. It's like all of a sudden you're seeing different things.
Yeah. Anybody else? Anything else? There's one more poem I wanted to share before we jump into the lesson. This is one of my favorites, Native Trees by W.S. Merwin. And there is no punctuation. And so the lines can be challenging to read. I want to see if I can get it all on the screen. Yeah, so it's called Native Trees. So whoever reads it, just read the title, because this way we can have the poem, the 2 stanzas, all on the screen at once. Or actually, maybe I can make it. Let's see if I can elongate it a little bit. Can I? No, I don't know if I can. So let's see. Can you guys see the whole thing now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Okay, good. So this is one of my favorite poems, but the first time you read it, you will stumble because there's no punctuation, and you as a reader need to take a breath, and you're not sure where you can or where you should, and that changes the meaning. So even though I know this poem, I'm not going to be the one to read it. I'm going to ask you guys to do it, and you'll see how the words all blend together, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about what you think of that. So who would like to read it first?
I could try.
Thanks.
Native trees. Neither my father nor my mother knew the names of the trees where I was born. What is that? I asked. My father and mother did not hear. They did not look where I pointed. Surfaces of furniture held the attention of their fingers, and across the room they could watch. Walls they had forgotten, where there were no questions, no voice, and no shade. Were there trees where there were children, where I had not been? I asked. Were there trees in those places where my father and my mother were born? And in that time, did my father and my mother see them? And when they said yes, it meant they did not remember. What were they? I asked, what were they? But both my father and my mother said they never knew.
I almost get emotional with this. I love this poem. Somebody want to read it a second time? Any volunteers?
I'll jump in if nobody else wants to.
Thanks, Sam.
Sure. Native trees. Neither my father nor my mother knew the names of the trees where I was born. What is that? I asked. And my father and mother did not hear. They did not look where I pointed. Surfaces of furniture held the attention of their fingers. And across the room, they could watch walls they had forgotten, where there were no questions, no voices, and no shade. Were there trees where they were children, where I had not been, I asked? Were there trees in those places where my father and my mother were born? And in what time, that time, did my father and my mother see them? And when they said yes, it meant they did not remember. What were they, I asked? What were they? But both my father and my mother said they never knew.
Thank you. So thoughts about this poem?
Certainly it's about a disconnect from nature and a disconnect from the world around you. At least that's what I take initially. My first pass at it is how we've lost this connection with the places we were born in or the places we grew up in, and have lost the ability in this age to look around us and understand how immersed we are or should be in that world. We've divorced ourselves from it. It's part of what I take away.
Cool.
I think it's hard to read. I think there's a disconnect in almost like imitating the awkwardness of the conversation with the parents or something, because and I think the lack of punctuation actually, I don't know if it emphasizes it, but it certainly makes sense that it's difficult to read without the punctuation, which lines carry over from which lines are kind of ending points. Even the reversal, I mean, I find it so interesting because I always say mother and father and never father and mother. And so that's got me on a pause thinking, is that how everyone does it? Or is that different? Is that part of the awkwardness? Is it because I'm a girl? But that was one of the stopping places for me, was that kind of unusual, for me, writing in that way.
Sure. Thank you. Anybody else?
I feel like it's disconnect, maybe not so much with nature, but in the family, that the father and mother are not listening to the child and don't really know what they are asking. And so if the child feels like they're answering just yes, to get him to stop asking, I don't know, I assume it's a boy. It's that intrepidness of children to just keep asking questions that don't make sense to parents and them discounting it. That's what I see in it.
Sure.
Yeah. I love this on that point, the lines, surfaces of furniture held the attention of their fingers. This, both the notion of getting the trees being the starting point became manufactured.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're drumming their fingers instead of paying attention to their son is like, wow.
So is anybody thinking about also how trees can have this double entendre? There's literally the trees where you grew up, but the family tree, the connections in the family, and the blurring of the lines and the sort of clutteredness, or I don't know where to start and stop in this poem, is sort of sending a non-literal message, a more metaphorical message about these intergenerational connections or breaks. Just, a thought.
Not, but interesting.
Yeah. If you notice in the second stanza, the third line from the bottom has a capital W. It's the only place in the poem where W.S. Merwin gives us an indication that it's a new idea starting. Everything else is just, flowing through. It just sort of all blends one into the next. And there's I love the line breaks here, and I love the blurring because it makes us stop and think about each line. Like the very first time I read this, which I can't even remember when that was, neither my father nor my mother knew. So I stop and I think about that. Like they didn't know things. Like that's its own idea. But then they didn't know the names of the trees. And then they didn't know the names of the trees where I was born. So there's just so many layers of meaning in this that because there's no pause, there's no hesitation, it just let's just throw all the words together in there. But there are line breaks which create ideas with the words on each line, even though they blend into one another. I think it's brilliant. Other people could find it a struggle, but I don't know. Any other thoughts about this poem?
The one place that I find really interesting here is that it's pretty easy, the names of the trees where I was born, what is that? Like those things seem like, okay, you can make those little leaps easily. It's from pointed to surfaces that is the most difficult leap. They did not look where I pointed. And it feels like, okay, that's a sentence. And then surfaces of furniture held the attention, and pointed surfaces, like it's just the most awkward of all of the movements in the thing in the poem. And it's kind of fascinating that I don't know, I don't know what to make of that, actually. It just feels like the most difficult moment of the poem.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, literally, when I read, they did not look where I pointed, I almost want to look, where are you pointing? Like it almost gives me a physical response. So it's almost a pause in itself, even though there's no indication with punctuation that we should pause there. And pointed surfaces doesn't make any sense in the context of the poem. So blending those words together, it's uncomfortable, it's awkward. But it just makes me pause because I'm looking, where are you pointing? I want to see where it's going. So it's interesting.
I wonder if it's also its own piece of disjointedness in the first stanza. It's getting at the disjointedness of the conversation the child is trying to have with his parents. I wonder.
Yeah, could be. The other thing to think about when you read poems, and we'll move on in a moment, is, and this is in any kind of writing, repetition of the same words or concepts it should be done purposefully. It should bring your attention to that concept or that idea or those words. There is a lot of repetition in here of simple words and of ideas, but that's something to pay attention to when you're reading in the future too, and when you're writing. Do you mean to repeat because this idea is so important, you want the reader to pay attention? Or are you doing it because you didn't realize that you should vary word choice? And so when you get a poem that's finished like this, repetition is, I'm going to assume, deliberate. At least I hope so. So, father and mother are repeated throughout, trees are repeated. But even the questions, let's see, what were they? I asked, what were they? Why it's being asked twice, that's worthy of conversation, which we won't spend time on today, but, and then where they were children in the second line of the second stanza. So it's a different sort of combination, but same idea. And so these ideas of like knowing and identity and, bigger, deeper concepts are sort of suggested too. All right. Thanks for indulging me. I really appreciate that. Any questions before we jump into the lesson? No? All right. So I'm going to start by just saying that I believe what makes a poem is line breaks and white space. So that's the premise in this class, that there are lots of literary elements that you use to form poems, but they are visibly distinct from prose because of the way the lines appear and the way that the entire poem appears on a page. Okay, we're going to put a pin in the idea of prose poetry, and we can come back to that. But generally, poems are lineated and they make use of white space, and they're visibly attracting as well as literarily attracting. So that's just the simple differentiation. So that tells me that poems are dialogues between the presence of text and the absence that is the deliberate white space. So I'll say that again. Poems are dialogues between the presence of text and the absence that is the deliberate white space. And by the way, you can take notes, but you don't have to because this is in the drive. So you can feel free to look at it to follow along if you want, or look at it later too. And I'll share my screen a little bit. So when a line ends in a prose piece, it's arbitrary. It's dictated by margins on the page, right? You leave like 1-inch margins on each side and you fill the space. And that's why prose poems don't utilize line breaks, and they are qualified by the word prose. So prose flows, but it doesn't care where it goes. You know, it's like there is a flow to it, but it's just sort of taking up the space. So line breaks then build poems, and many writers have no clue how to use them effectively. If you're not taking advantage of the dynamism and the aesthetic value of the ink abutting the blankness, you're not writing the best poetry you can. Like the words come, but then you have to be the artist and really shape it. And so it's something to think about. And I know it's funny, you know, when we're kids, we write poems and we're like, you know, roses are red, violets are blue, cool. I'm a poet, you know, and that's great when you're a kid. But if you want to be taken seriously as a writer, we should be able to go through different versions, just like we revise prose. We should be open to the idea that a poem is not finished just because we put it on the page and do some line breaks. Like, let's give it some thought. Let's be purposeful in how we construct our poems, which is why you guys are here. April, you have a question? Did you want to ask in the class or no? But you're on mute.
Yeah, no, I know I'm on mute. I think this is a question for later, and it regards Sharon Olds and her
Okay.
Her definitive stance on line breaks. And it's always like something, but I don't think right now is the time to ask that question.
Okay, well, if you want to send it to me, we can talk about it offline, and I can weave it in next week too. Okay. All right, so a poetic line break, what is it? It's the deliberately placed threshold where a line of poetry ends and the next one begins. Plain and simple, right? There is a difference between a line and a sentence. A sentence expresses a complete thought. A line is a linear streak of text flowing across a page. A line can be a container for sentences, and it can contain a complete sentence, but it doesn't have to. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Let me share my screen. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of versions here. We see this one, a crow chittered throatily. That's the end of the line, okay? And then we see a different version over here, and I don't have this whole poem, so I apologize. A crow chittered throatily, the wind stopped. So it's two sentences on a line, right? Then we have a couple of other options here. A crow chittered throatily, the wind stopped. We continued as breath. And then the next option, blue fall blue, a crow chittered throatily, the wind stopped. We continued as breath. And then we have two other examples, throatily, a crow chittered. And then we see another option below that, throatily, a crow chittered, the wind stopped traffic, within the rough hush, a peace. So there's no right or wrong in any of these, they're just different options. How do they come across to you? What are the different effects? Tian? Did you have a thought?
Oh, I think that it adds to the complexity of the thinking the more breaks you have.
Okay.
That would be my first instinct to answer, that it just seems to be more complex when you're adding an emphasis every few words.
Yeah.
Than if it was written in prose.
Sure. Sam, did you have a thought?
So the last one almost reminds me more of improvisational jazz.
Okay.
Like it's more jointed and disjointed all at the same time.
Sure.
And I guess to the earlier point, causes you to kind of pause a little longer and say, okay, what's going on here, right?
Yeah. So go ahead, Sam, sorry.
No, but I like the first one too. A crow chittered throatily, the wind stopped. It brings in a sense, a conclusion, right, to these events going together.
Sure. And it changes the meaning depending on how you lineate, and it's what your intention is, which is why I always tell writers, know why you're writing a piece. And anybody that I've coached knows that, and I work on this too, you need to have a thread that's running through whatever you're writing that that everything ties to, so that there's some cohesion, so that there's some kind of message or theme. And so you get to decide that when you're doing the writing, right? But in any kind of writing, what is the impact if you have longer lines versus shorter lines?
I think that comes down to the breath.
Yes.
And just where, I mean, especially like that last one, I think Sam said it best with that. It's really like jazz. It kind of throws you with how it's broken up with, you really have to pay attention to the line, but I think it's really, you have to pay attention to the breath as well as the words.
Yeah. So, I mean, the literal impact of a lot of short staccato lines, it makes your heart beat faster and you're out of breath. It's like, did it. Longer is like, it's drawn out, it's calmer. If you have a book that you're reading and they're all very long sentences, you may feel sleepy. If they're all very short sentences while you're reading, you may feel like really intense. There is an impact. And so when you're writing prose and maybe poems, you want to vary that length so that you keep the attention of your reader. In a poem, it's way more stark. And so, of just three short lines together can create an intensity, or three long lines can create a laziness or a lingering. And you have to think about, what's the purpose of this piece? What impact do I want to have on my reader? There's a lot of thought that goes into that. April?
Yeah, there's also the question of sound, aside from pacing or breath, as so that when you get the second one, a crow chittered throatily, the wind stopped, we continued as breath. The breath and throat near rhyme comes out much more than it does, I think, in some of the other line break work. So that's part of it too, is how the sound moves as well as the breath moving.
Yeah, and Liwen, I know you had your hand up. I just want to say this last example at the bottom of the page, there's more internal rhyme in that arrangement. Throatily, a crow. So you have this oh like sound in the first line. Chittered the wind, like that flat I. Chittered the wind. Stopped traffic within the rough hush. Like there's a softness there. So I found the sound more impactful for me in this last version, but internal. But it's subtle, and it may not have the same effect when it's arranged differently too. Liwen, what were you going to say?
I just want the last one. I found it's more powerful, it's deeper, and wind stop the traffic. And then I like the last word, a piece. So is in the beginning, I was wondering what's it about, and then I liked the writer, a piece. So it make you really want to think.
Yeah.
It's like step by step, from the animal to wind. The wind can stop traffic, and the hush and peace is like there's a layer, and then nothing.
Yes.
So it's more emotional driven for me, the last one.
Yep. And my apologies for not having the whole poem here, because that would have helped. But I liked seeing the different examples and just discussing sort of what are the impacts. And that should impact your decision to break lines in certain ways or arrange words in certain ways. What is the impact going to be if I group these words together, or if I add words to them, if I break the line here or I break it there? And what impact do I want to have on my reader? There's a very deliberateness to writing. If you want to step into those shoes, it's what makes good writing is when it really incites a reaction in people. They feel something, and they're having this conversation with you, even if you're miles away. And so putting some thought and intention into it is huge, and frankly can make your job easier, for sure.
I was wondering, because I like to play around with fonts, because I do believe that each font has its own kind of character. How do you think that plays with like if you had like, I mean, obviously not Comic Sans, but like something like, something where something's more of a script font, or things like, each one has its own kind of weight, and having some of the font take on some of that weight of, also with the line break.
So I never really vary the fonts in in my writing because I'm more focused on the words. It doesn't mean you shouldn't or you couldn't. That to me speaks more of artistry, and maybe it's something that you're really like decorating the poem with the font, with the white space, with the line breaks, and that's fine. You want to be careful not to include some fonts that are just not easy to read, because then you're sort of making it hard for some people to access the poem. So sometimes those scripty fonts can be a little challenging, because the whole point of now poetry really has two purposes. There's the auditory exchange, because if you've ever gone to a poetry reading, it does not matter what it looks like on the page, it's how it's performed. And that is a whole experience, and it's really powerful. And you embody a poem so differently than if you just read it by yourself. But if you are reading it, you want it to be an exchange between writer and reader. And so you just want to give everybody the biggest chance of being able to access it the way you want them to. So yeah, that could be fun, just think about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. So a line break is a poetic device that is used at the end of a line, think of it that way, and the beginning of the next line in a poem. It doesn't need traditional punctuation. You can do what you want with punctuation, understanding that each piece of punctuation has a purpose. So, you could use a semicolon, you could use a colon, you could use a dash, you could use an em dash, you could use, whatever. I mean, there are people who use parentheses. Punctuation is a tool, just like a line break is a tool. A lot of people, when they're new at poetry, will just end each line at the end of a sentence or with a period. And that doesn't feel like poetry to me. You could argue that, and you could win. But the truth is that you want to use punctuation as deliberately as you break the lines. Really think about, where do I want someone to pause, or where do I want the words to flow into one another? A line break can also be a place where you divide a line into two halves. And a line break that occurs at mid-clause creates what we call enjambment. And so I'm going to put that word in the chat so that you fully get it. Enjambment is huge, and we're going to talk a lot about that. It's just the term that is where, we break it in the middle of a thought. And so, but ultimately a line break is the termination of one line of poetry in the beginning of another. That's really what it is. Yes, Sam.
So, and this is just me being a rookie, I guess, but I understood enjambment as the breaking of a line across stanzas, not within a stanza. Was I too limited on that understanding?
Yes and no. So yes, but it can also be within a stanza when you're just continuing the flow of an idea.
Okay.
Yeah. So not just stopping at like the end of an idea, start of a new one, but you're getting it to blend.
Right.
So line breaks divide poems into lines. The length of lines, by the way, does determine the appearance of the poem on the page. So long and skinny, short and wide, or a shape entirely its own, indenting or creating it as a picture. So the words are like in the shape of whatever you're writing about. That's fun in children's poetry a lot, but not just children, we can do that as well. The location of a line break can be dictated by the number of syllables in the line, but you can also freely choose it. Like you could want a certain rhythm and just break it when you get to that rhythm on each line so that there's a musicality to the poem. And a lot of the formal structures of poetry do just that. But I'm really addressing free verse. I come to poetry from the perspective of the poet has all the power, and you can use any of those structures. You can write a sonnet, you can write a haiku, you can do, whatever, and they have certain dictates, but you can also just create your own. I had a friend who she's Jewish, and I'm Jewish as well, and she would write what she called haiku. So chai is the number 18. It means life in Hebrew. And so a haiku is 17 syllables. She did haikus, which were 18 syllables. Like, it was her thing, So like she knew what a haiku was, and then she gave herself permission to evolve it for her purposes. So like I said, know some rules so that you can know how to expand them, So
Can I
yeah.
ask a question here?
Yeah.
So I rely very heavily on syllables for line breaks.
Yep.
And one of the things that I always question is the not the number of syllables. This is where I fall apart, is not on the number of syllables, but on the stress beats.
Okay.
And so I just wonder if you could talk about, I mean, or is that something you'll talk about later, the differences between syllables and stress beats and how they can inform the line break?
So it sounds like you have a preference, right, April? Like you like a certain rhythm or flow?
Well, I don't know if I would call it preference. That might be too sophisticated a word for me at this point. I think that it has something to do with, like if you're talking about blank verse and iambic pentameter, and I don't want to, I hope that everybody is with me on this. That's the question. So if you're going for, you want 5 stress beats in your, right? But you can't manage that because where's the stress? Who's putting the stress on? Is it a natural stress? Is it like, that's the part. And then if you just simply count syllables, you don't have to worry about any of that.
Right.
But are you then sort of tossing out the rhythm in an adherence to a strict count?
So I guess the way I would answer it is to ask a question: why is it that you want to do that? And it's a rhetorical question. It's something that when you're writing, you want to examine and be like, how does this strengthen or benefit the story that I'm telling in this poem? And is it helping the reader to get the impact and the experience of my words better or not? Because sometimes we can set out to do something in a certain structure and it can be a great idea, and then the reality of it falls apart because like the syllables are off or whatever, and you're trying to fit it into the mold, and so something gets lost, like the meaning gets lost, or the reader is stuck on, like the rhythm or the lack of rhythm and not on the meaning. So I have a friend who's a really well-published poet. She's a professor at a university teaching poetry, and we workshop together once a month. And she's doing what's called ekphrastic poems, which is when you write about art. And so she's engaging with a bunch of Van Gogh paintings. Brilliant. She's like a brilliant poet. And there were a couple of poems that we were workshopping, and I always come to things with the free verse lens. And that isn't fair because not everybody's doing free verse. There might be, iambic pentameter. It might be intended to be a sonnet or whatever. And that's great. But I always look at it as, how did I experience it as a reader? And so one of the poems, I was saying to her, oh, I really wanted this line to be moved up to this stanza. And she's like, well, I was trying to go with this structure. And that's great. But as a reader, I thought that those lines belonged together and that created a better experience for me as a reader. She can think I'm ridiculous and she gets to decide because she's the poet, and ultimately she'll write it the way she wants to. But that was my feedback to her, was like, here's my experience of these words, So I think asking yourself why is a super first step, because then you can examine, is it worth the struggle or not?
Mm-hmm.
That help, April?
Well, it's interesting, and it helps in terms of, if I think about where is meaning disrupted, because I'm not trying to do iams. I'm just simply counting syllables, but it does make me wonder if there is more that can be done, which
Always.
Right.
Yeah. And I sometimes when I do my line breaks, I look at, if I break it in a certain place, am I going to get some internal rhyme or some end rhyme that I wouldn't have had otherwise? And that creates a rhythm and musicality all its own that's really fun. And so I tend to go in those directions, but sometimes you can play around with the line breaks. Like, well, what happens if I do it here? Well, what happens if I make it this? And have a few versions and see which one feels the best to you. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to.
I was wondering, at a workshop that I did the other day, once someone had a poem and they had that the word was actually split between the two lines. like it was like strummed, but it was like strum, and then the other less was strum med. Strummed.
I probably
And-
would have said something about it as the critique partner, but yes, what were your thoughts, Steve?
Well, I mean, I found it. I actually, when I read it, it was I didn't get it because it was weird to see the word like split up like that. But when it was read, and like and with it, it just made it was just like, you know, I kind of like having to do work. And I know I put my poor audience through that they have to do work because there's a lot of chaos and all this stuff because there's people speaking over people and things like that. So there's a lot of, so, you know, line breaks do help me, but also the thing is that like I want people to pay attention to, or actually to different parts of the poem that might not be the part that I'm reading or whatever. But I just wanted to know, would that be considered enjambment when you have the word? And I really enjoyed it actually once I saw the word, and I couldn't unsee it. But I liked having to kind of do that work.
I would call that experimental, is what I would call it. But I think I understand what you're saying. And I think it's so I like to think of myself as a rebel author and really shaking things up. And I definitely march to the beat of my own drum and do things my way. But when things make perfect sense to me, or I think they're really cool, radical chaos that I'm creating, and nobody is getting it whenever I like share a piece with someone, then have I achieved my mission? You know, because the whole point of writing is to be connecting over ideas and to opening people's minds and to, you know, to really just like have this global conversation. And if they're prevented from doing that because of the experimentation, is it achieving the goal? So I think sometimes it works really well and it's great, and we should always take chances and take risks, but also be open to the idea that if it's not penetrating, if it takes too much work, are we achieving our goal? Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else? Anybody else? Lori?
Hi, yeah. So I did website development for so long, and the experimental aspects of this, where you kind of force the reader or the viewer to figure out where all the navigation is, because it's fancy and fun. We call it, in the industry, we call it mystery meat. And I would apply that to this description of the experiment. Anything that's impenetrable and just fanciful, I think, is a problem.
I mean, I agree with that. I think that there's nothing wrong with emphasizing differently when you're performing poetry and then amending it for the page, so that somebody who doesn't get the joy of seeing you perform it or hearing you perform it can still access it. You know, because like I think a lot of times we writers take ourselves so seriously and we're the only ones who get it. And it's like, what have I achieved? You know what I mean? Like regularly I write brilliantly, and then people are like, I don't get these paragraphs, and I'm like, what's wrong with you? It's brilliant to me, you know. But like, if too many people don't get it, it may not be so brilliant, you know. Like, I have to accept it. So yeah, it just happened to me last night. Actually, I was with a group of writers, a piece that I wrote that is a really great piece, and it's ready to go, it's ready to be published, it's prose. But there were two paragraphs that several of the writers were like, this part, I'm not seeing it. And I'm like, okay, this part has to go. And it's okay, because it was like 4,000 words and I can take two paragraphs out and it'll be fine. But I had to be open to that, because even though I do think those two paragraphs were pretty great, if they're causing a delay in the connection with my reader, I have to be open to cutting them. Different than poems, but it's the same for all writing. Okay, so I think we can all agree that line breaks serve an important function in setting the rhythm of a poem, inserting pauses, conveying ideas and meaning. And it's really a line break, with or without punctuation, puts a pause between the final word of one line and the first word of the next. And so it's pretty common to break lines where natural pauses might happen in language, right? It also is really common to put punctuation there. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, or you have one image, then you have another image. But the power of poetry is when you do it in unconventional ways. And so you break a line, or you pause in a place where you wouldn't normally pause, because you're giving extra meaning or extra emphasis or an extra moment of thought to something longer than you would if it just all ran together. So there's a huge power in line breaks. And I want you guys to embrace that power and to really think about how you can use it for good and not for evil, right? Yes, like it is a power, and know that. So think about, you know, lines that give rhyme and meter, but that also give the unpredictability of meaning. Okay. All right. Regardless of what structure of poetry you're using, the way the lines end is really important to the poem, period. Just always is. The line break is hugely fundamental, and the last word in a line should have high significance. So if you're ending on and or the, revisit that. Like really look and see if that was the best choice. And also ask yourself, does the last word in a line simplify, confuse, or complicate meaning? And ask yourself, what is the effect on the sound and the rhythm by ending on that word? You know, and then if your line break flows with syntax or disrupts it, what is the impact of that? These are important questions. So that's why, I mean, you can write the words for your poem, you can do your draft, and you could spend weeks or months on the breaks, because it is like being a sculptor where you're really trying to make those right decisions. I'm not saying that to overwhelm you. You don't have to spend months on it. It might come to you. This might be the most fun part for you, but just know that there's a power in it. And so you want to make sure, just like when you're writing a book, the first line and last line of every chapter should blow your mind, because, you know, the first line gets your reader to keep reading. The last line gets them to turn the page and keep going. You never want someone to put a bookmark in your book. You want them to just like, I can't do anything else. I have to finish this book today. Same thing with poetry. Like, you want to know that the words you choose, first of all, are the ones that are best and important. And then first line, last word on every line. Super, super important. Any questions?
Of course, I have a couple of questions.
Please.
Were there other hands?
Go for it, April.
Okay, so one of the things is that occasionally you don't want, I think occasionally one does not want that pause at the end of the line. They want it to run into the next one. And so I'm going to take it that that rules are rules, but they're not hard and fast forever.
Right.
Kind of thing. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but if you end a line, there's going to be even a slight pause.
Right.
The way poetry is. And so if you don't want to pause there, don't end it there.
And then my second question is, I was totally fascinated when you said that you write your poems in lines and then go back and put in the line breaks. Because I have discovered in writing for many years that there are rhythms that I naturally go to. So that in my journals there will be line breaks. They may not be the right ones, but there will be line breaks, just because, and I think that we all have a kind of natural affinity for certain rhythms or so. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think I mean, when I start, I'm almost like stream of consciousness and just writing down the ideas or the images or whatever. And that's sort of what I do. Well, for sure with poetry, I just like fill up the page, and then I'll go back and I'll really look at it. And sometimes I even cut out half the words, like, oh, I didn't need this. Oh, I didn't, you know, like, so like when I lineate, it's almost like a round of revision, because, you know, I'm taking a look at the raw ideas and I'm molding it. Is what I'm doing, you know. But that's just how I do it, because first I want to think about what is it I want to say, and then how can I present this in a way that's going to come across most vividly, most arrestingly for my reader. So yeah, that's just been my process.
Yeah. And in terms of like the physicality of, we all have internal rhythms or we've internalized a certain way of being as human beings, and also as, you know, whether we are human beings that were settled through water, or settled, you know, the whole water versus land settling. So do you have any, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about that or not.
Tell me more about this water and land thing that you're talking about.
Yeah. So in terms of like the Anglo-Saxon stress beat, which is something that is comes from the from rowing, you know, and how it works, and that how, because people settled through this way of movement over before settling into geographical places, that human beings have internalized that kind of stress in, you know, just that's how we work. That's what advertisement is based on, is the Anglo-Saxon stress beat, versus say more of an animal like, you know, or drumming over land, you know, and that human beings have physicalized in terms of the way they think or approach the world.
I think that's a really big, I think that's a really big idea. My gut reaction is to say, yeah, but, because there are so many different influences, you know, like my family didn't come from the Anglo-Saxons, you know, like
Neither did mine, but
you know what I'm saying? Like, and what were our influences? Like, you know, are my influences, you know, Eastern European? Are they ancient Israel? Are they like, is there an indigenous influence in some way? Like, I don't know. I think, you know, we've all been taught in such biased ways, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unconsciously, you know, what we learn and what we don't learn, and also just our environmental impacts, you know. I think that's a pretty big topic that is interesting, and I would love to spend time on. I don't want to spend a lot of it here, but I think that we have unconscious, I guess, ways of writing that just sort of permeate us based on all of the influences around us. I think they're more contemporary than ancient.
Right. And that was my point too, that we do have a kind of like, do we have as individuals have a certain way of working with rhythms that will then impact our line breaks, or or is it all a learned thing, you know? And again, I don't mean to you know, take the conversation in places it doesn't need to go.
That's okay. I do think it's all a learned thing, and I think that it can be expanded and unlearned as well. And I think it's fascinating. There is a book, let me find it. It's, sorry, Matthew Salesis. Oh, where is it? I think it's called Craft in Real Time. I'll find it and I'll tell you guys. But it's fascinating because it basically talks about how the ways we write in quote unquote Western countries, Europe, US, Canada, whatever, we take it for granted that that's the way you write. It's very different in Asia and Africa. It's not good or bad. It's just style. So we're very plot driven here in, you know, these more waspy Western cultures. And that's not the case in literature and other places. And so we look at it and say, you know, I don't know what to do with this, but they say the same thing with us. And so that tells me that we could go down a rabbit hole of studying all different ways of approaching literature and expand our minds immeasurably, and then decide, well, what do you want to incorporate? What do you bring to it? You know, I think it's important to be aware that those biases exist, and that we don't even realize how impacted we are by what we've been exposed to and what we haven't been exposed to. And I think it's really important to take deliberate steps to read works by totally different writers to see how it can be treated. In fact, there's a piece that that I love, and I will send it to you guys. It's not poetry, but it was written by a Polish writer in the 80s when he was in Africa, and there are some very distinct Polish approaches as well as very distinct African approaches. And I love the piece, and some people don't. I'll send it to you guys, but I think it just only makes us better, you know, to consider all these things. Okay, a little bit more about line breaks before we adjourn for today. Yes?
Please.
All right. So line breaks can be a really dynamic piece of your poem. So they can infuse words with strength and meaning. They're hugely important. They can bring ambiguity, but they can also affect the meaning because of how you put words together or separate them. And line breaks can even lead readers into surprising ideas and different ways of understanding your poem. Also control the journey through the poem. So like feeding little pieces, releasing little pieces, or like throwing it at them all at once. So just understand that you want to take some careful crafting when you're going through, your poem, and think about word, think about sound, think about spacing, think about punctuation. All of that impacts the line break. And so, when you read the end of a line and you move down to begin the next, the last word of that line is still hanging on. It's like dangling in your memory for a second until you start the new one. And so again, I want you to think about, like, where should people linger when they're reading your poem, and where can they move through quickly? That's really, really important. There's also energy and tension that you want to put into a poem, and the line breaks can be really helpful in that. So that has to do with how the poem flows, but also the rhythm of it. How words and syllables and lines can speed up or slow the reader down, building that energy or releasing it at the right time. So you want to play with that build up and release of tension in a poem, and line breaks can help you do that as well. And then finally, I want to just talk about the visualness of the lines. Like, that is really important because you want the poem to appear like a poem from first glance. And that visual shape draws attention. Some words might even leap out at the reader from the start before they really engage with the poem, based on how you've put it together. So I want to show you some lines. And it's going to be interesting. I'm not going to release the details yet until we see it. So let's look at these lines. Does anybody want to read them? Anyone?
I
Okay.
will. Okay.
Do you want me to go, Lynn?
Clara, did you want to go?
Or Claire?
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah. Let's give Clara a turn. Sure.
All right, please.
The night hours passed and the dark was against the truck. Sometimes cars passed them, going west and away, and sometimes great trucks came up out of the west and rumbled eastward, and the stars flowed down as a slow cascade over the western horizon.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to surprise you guys, but these lines came from the Grapes of Wrath. They're not a poem. And so the interesting thing is that, it has a different effect when you lineate as opposed to when you read it here on the page further down. So if I read it that way, it's the night hours passed and the dark was in against the truck. Sometimes cars passed them going west and away, and sometimes great trucks came up out of the west and rumbled eastward, and the stars flowed down in a slow cascade over the western horizon. So how are the words different, or the meanings different, when we have line breaks versus when we have it as prose?
When it was read as poetry, it seemed more profound.
Yeah, right?
It seemed like you had to give measure to everything. And then when it was in prose, it was like you just rushed through this. But really, that last line, "and the stars flowed down," is a remarkable line, and it deserves poetry.
So I'm going to ask you guys to take the lines here and lineate them the way you think you should for the best impact. So let's take 5 minutes. You jot those lines down, and I want to hear how you decide to lineate them. Doesn't have to be the way it was here, that's just random, but for meaning, for impact, for, weight. And let's see what you come up with, okay? And I'll put them in the chat to make it easier if you want.
Perfect.
Okay? Let's take 5 minutes and you see what you come up with. Let's take about 30 seconds more. Does anybody want to share what you came up with? I can make you a co-host if you want to share your screen. Lee-Wen.
Can I just read?
Yeah, sure.
The night hours passed, and the dark was in against the truck. Sometimes cars passed them, going west and away, and sometimes great trucks came up out of the west and rumbled eastward. And the stars flowed down in a slow cascade over the western horizon.
Nice. Nice.
So I basically pause at a point when I do the line break.
Sure, sure. I love it. Awesome.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yeah, Lori.
Can I share my screen?
Yeah, let me give you privileges. There you go. You are now privileged.
Can you see it?
Yes. Yep.
So the night hours passed and the dark was in against the truck. Sometimes cars passed them going west and away, and sometimes great trucks came up out of the west and rumbled eastward. And the stars flowed down in a slow cascade over the western horizon.
Nice. I like the internal rhyme of flowed and slow. Very nice. Okay. Anybody else want to go?
I can go.
Steve and then Sam. Steve, do you want to share?
No, I can read.
Okay, great.
The night hours passed and the dark was in against the truck. Sometimes cars passed them going west and away, and sometimes great trucks came up out of the west and rumbled eastward, and the stars flowed down in a slow cascade over the western horizon.
So I'm hearing a lot of one-word lines. Yeah?
Yes.
Cool. Nice. Sam, did you want to go?
Sure.
You want to share your screen?
No, I was scribbling on my page and my handwriting is
Okay.
functionally illegible.
Okay.
The night hours passed and the dark was in against the truck. Sometimes cars passed them, going west and away, and sometimes great trucks came up out of the west and rumbled eastward. And the stars flowed down in a slow cascade over the western horizon.
Nice. Beautiful. By the way, the word them, I just wanted to get rid of it. I just felt like that word shouldn't be there. So I didn't give you that option, but I would have cut it out. So yeah. Anybody else want to share? Anyone?
I will.
Yeah, thanks, Deanne. Do you want to share your screen?
No, I'm scribbler too.
Okay.
Okay. The night hours passed and the dark was in against the truck. Sometimes cars passed them going west and away, and sometimes great trucks came up out of the west and rumbled eastward, and the stars flowed down in a slow cascade over the westward horizon.
Nice. Beautiful. So it's really very personal how we break lines. And that's why we can all take the same words and come up with a very different impact and meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really fun. I think that's just a very cool part of writing. Any last questions before we finish for today? Liwen?
Yeah, very quick question. I really like this last exercise. This is like we all play with our emotions. So the question is, when we read, right? Read a poem, do we pause at a line break, or do we just read? I forgot when first you showed us the poem. I forgot who read it. You just we connect as our own thought, or we read line break, a pause?
So a line break that doesn't have any punctuation gets a slight pause. If there's a comma there, it gets a little bit more of a pause. If it's a period or a colon or a semicolon, it's a harder pause. So it's just a little bit longer depending on the punctuation. But it's so slight when there's no punctuation there. It's intended to take a breath or half a breath and then flow into the next, but not be like stilted, where we're like stop, start. So reading poems aloud is an art, and it's something that you learn and you perfect over time, because it doesn't feel like we would normally read. So it can be really fun, really sensual, really like evocative when you get in your groove. But it takes learning for sure.
Yeah, when everybody's reading their poems, because we don't project on the screen, yeah. I'm trying to figure out where is her line break. So I was trying to figure out, and then I try to detect from the little pause.
Yeah.
Where is it? So I'm a little confused.
Well, you know what would be fun, and we don't have time for it, but I wish we did, would be like if each of you read again and the rest of us wrote as we heard it and see if it matches up to what you wrote.
Yeah.
Because I bet we get it half right and half not, but like it could be a really fun exercise.
Okay.
Maybe next time. All right, before we conclude, I just want to encourage you to take a look at the Google Drive. We did not finish the whole lesson today, as I knew we wouldn't. So I think we got to the end of page 4 or 5, and there's like 9 pages. So feel free to go through it. There are some exercises in there if you'd like to do them. There's also a whole document of exercises in the Drive if you wanted to work on them. Reminder that I will review up to 2 poems per person submitted during this class. It's just 4 weeks, which sounds like a long time, but it's going to fly by. So if you want me to look at something, make sure you either email it to me or you put it in the Drive and let me know sooner than later, because before you know it, it's going to be like the last week and you're going to be like, oh my God, I didn't do it. So yeah, I want to make sure you get the most out of it. Lori,
Is that read just between us or is it the whole class?
it's just for me to do. I don't like to burden my students with having to give a lot of feedback to their peers. If you build a bond with somebody in the class and you want to do that, be my guest. That'd be great. But I'm happy to do it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. See you guys next week. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.